David set the heavy cream-colored invitation on top of my hospital discharge folder and said it like he was reading me the weather forecast. This Friday, my entire department is coming for dinner. Callaway is finally going to see where we live. I need everything perfect. Appetizers, main course, dessert, the house spotless. It's the night before the promotion decision. This is it. I was propped against the headboard with a heating pad pressed to my abdomen, the stitches pulling every time I breathed too deep. 3 days earlier, Dr. Amari had removed a mass the size of a grapefruit from my left ovary, along with endometriosis adhesions that she later told me had been slowly strangling my intestines for years without my knowing. The discharge instructions were printed in bold, on the paper now half hidden under David's invitation. No lifting over 5 pounds, no standing longer than 10 minutes at a time, minimum 3 weeks of rest, no strenuous activity, no bending, no twisting, no cooking large meals. I had highlighted that last line with a yellow marker, hoping he would see it without my having to point it out again. I didn't scream. I've never been good at screaming in the moment. My instinct has always been to fold inward, to make myself smaller, to find the path of least resistance and take it, believing that peace was something you purchased with compliance. I looked at his face, the way he was already scrolling through his phone checking the guest list, the way his jaw had that set, focused look he got before client pitches, the way his attention was already in the dining room, already arranging the seating chart in his head, and I said quietly, "David, I can't. I'm not even allowed to lift a pot of water. Please, can you postpone it? Even a week? I'll still be recovering, but I can at least. Mia, you don't understand." He finally looked up, and his voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was dismissive, like he was explaining something to a child who couldn't grasp basic arithmetic. "Callaway doesn't do postponed. If we miss this window, Kenneth from the downtown office gets the VP slot. I've been working toward this for 8 years. 8 years. And you can't stand in a kitchen for one evening? I just had surgery. The doctor says a lot of things. You're strong. You always bounce back." My mother hosted a dinner party 3 days after her gallbladder surgery. She managed. That sentence buried itself somewhere in the space between my ribs. His mother, Patricia, the woman who once told me, when I was on bed rest during a difficult early pregnancy that I later lost, that women in her day didn't have the luxury of lying around. The woman who had never once in 15 years asked about my illustration work, because to her a job you did at home in soft pants wasn't a real job. The woman who, at our wedding, had pulled me aside and said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "You'll take care of him, won't you?" David needs someone who understands that his career comes first. I nodded the way I'd learned to nod after years of being told my resistance was a temporary inconvenience to be waited out. The argument would exhaust me more than the compliance would, and right then, with the stitches pulling and the pain medication making everything slightly gauzy, I didn't have the strength for a war, so I said nothing else. David left the room satisfied, already texting his mother the good news. I could hear the soft tap of his thumbs on the screen, and I was left alone with the invitation, the discharge papers, and a feeling that had been growing in me for years. A quiet, cold thing that I'd been too busy to name. That night, I lay awake while David's breathing evened out on his side of the bed. The pain meds made my thoughts drift, but not enough to block the memories that marched through my head in a neat, bitter line, every single time. Every single time his career needed something, my life, my body, my plans folded into themselves like a paper fan. The year we were supposed to go to my sister's wedding in Oregon, I had already bought the dress, a soft sage green chiffon that made me feel beautiful for the first time in years, and the flights were booked, and I'd been asked to give a toast. Had written it out on index cards and practiced in front of the bathroom mirror. Cancelled 3 days before because David had a make-break presentation that he insisted I help him rehearse for. I spent that weekend drilling him on PowerPoint slides in our living room while my sister got married under a canopy of Douglas firs, and by the time the presentation was over, the flights were unaffordable and the dress hung in my closet with the tags still on, and I watched my only sister become a wife through a grainy FaceTime call, while David clinked glasses with his boss at a celebratory dinner I wasn't invited to. The year I was shortlisted for a National Children's Book Illustration Award, the kind of recognition that could have changed my career, That could have meant higher advances and better contracts, and finally being seen as a real artist instead of a woman with a hobby, and the ceremony fell on the same night as David's company gala. He told me the award could wait, the gala couldn't. So I put on the dress he'd picked out, a navy blue sheath that was beautiful but not me, and stood next to him smiling in photographs, while somewhere across town, in a gallery filled with people who understood my world, someone else accepted an award I'd spent 2 years earning, the 3 separate Christmas Eves I'd spent alone at Patricia's house, decorating her tree with ornaments that had to be hung in a specific order, the glass ones at the top where the cat couldn't reach them, the wooden ones in the middle, the child-made ones at the bottom. Setting her table with the good china, because David had to fly out last minute for a client meeting and Patricia didn't want to be alone, and somehow I was the substitute body dispatched to fill the silence. I remember one of those nights very clearly. I had made a roast, had timed it perfectly, and Patricia had looked at it and said, "A little dry, but it's fine. Not thank you, not I'm glad you're here." Just that small cut so expertly placed I almost didn't feel it until later. And the dinners. My God, the dinners. At least 4 times a year I transformed our home into a showroom. The mid-century credenza polished until it gleamed, the gallery wall straightened, the conversation pit vacuumed with the special attachment that got into the seams, the smell of braised short ribs or roasted salmon drifting through the open kitchen, while I passed trays of hors d'oeuvres to people who asked me what my husband did for a living, and then immediately lost interest when I said I was an illustrator, as if drawing the pictures that made children laugh in libraries across the country was a charming little hobby, not a profession that had, until recently, quietly paid half our mortgage. I turned my head on the pillow and looked at the shadow of David's profile in the dark. I still loved him. That was the part that made everything harder. I loved the man who on our 3rd date had driven 2 hours through a rainstorm to bring me soup when I had a bad cold, who had sat on my tiny apartment couch and watched old movies with me while I sneezed into a blanket. I loved the man who had cried when we lost the baby, really cried, not the performative kind but the kind where his shoulders shook and he couldn't speak, and who had held my hand in the hospital room afterward and said, "We'll try again. When you're ready. Only when you're ready." I loved the man who had once framed one of my sketches, a little ink drawing of a fox I'd done on a scrap of paper, and hung it in his office before I even knew he'd taken it. That man existed. I had married him. But over 15 years, he had been slowly, almost imperceptibly, replaced by someone who looked at me and saw a supporting character in his life story. And I hadn't noticed the change happening, not really, until I was lying here with stitches in my belly and an invitation to a dinner party covering my medical instructions like a ransom note. At 2 a.m. I reached for my phone, not to scroll but to open the folder I kept buried in my email archives. It was labeled Willow House Location. I need to explain something about our house, because it matters to the story and it mattered to me in a way I hadn't let myself feel for years. It's not just any house. It's a 1962 mid-century modern, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows and a conversation pit in the living room that my grandmother had designed herself, sketching it out on a napkin in a diner while she was still a young set designer with big dreams and not enough money. She had built this house with an artist's eye. Every doorknob was a small sculpture. Every light fixture had been chosen because it cast shadows in a particular way. The angle of the roof was meant to catch the afternoon light and throw long golden rectangles across the living room floor at 4 p.m. I grew up in this house, not entirely, but enough. My parents died when I was 12, a car accident on a rain-slicked highway, and after that I came here to live with her. She taught me how to see, not just look, but really see, the way light changed the color of a wall, the way a room felt different depending on where you placed a chair. She was my whole world for 7 years until cancer took her too, quietly and gently, in the very bedroom I now shared with a man who had never once asked about her. When she passed, the house came to me, not to me and David. To me. It was in the will, clear as mountain water. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, the same one who had handled my parents' estate all those years ago, and listening to him read the words aloud. I leave my home and all its contents to my granddaughter, Mia Elaine Carter, to have and to hold as her own. David was there, but he had spent most of the appointment on his phone, stepping out twice to take calls, and when it was over he had patted my hand and said, "That's great, honey," without looking up. He never asked to see the deed. Not once in 7 years. He just moved his things into the primary bedroom, hung his diplomas in the hallway, placed his father's old armchair in the corner of the living room like it had always belonged there, and started referring to it as our place. A year ago, on a whim, a quiet rainy afternoon when David was at work and the house was mine alone, I had submitted photographs of the interior to a location scouting agency. I had done it as a daydream, a little act of honoring my grandmother's vision, a way of saying to her ghost, "Someone still sees what you made." I never expected anything to come of it. The agency was flooded with submissions. I assumed mine would vanish into a database and never be seen again. Then 5 months ago, something did. An independent film director named Simone Weller emailed me. She had been searching for months for the right 1960s interior to shoot a pivotal scene in her period piece. A story about a female architect fighting to be taken seriously in a man's world. She had scrolled through hundreds of submissions, she said, and then she saw the photos of the conversation pit, the original walnut paneling, the built-in planter, the way the light fell through the windows at the exact angle my grandmother had designed. And she had gasped. Actually gasped. She wanted to rent the house for 3 days of shooting, a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in early autumn. The location fee was $18,000. There was a contract, a binding one, with a cancellation penalty so steep it would cost more than we'd put into our savings account the previous year. I had signed it and kept it secret, not out of deceit, but because I wanted to surprise David. His 40th birthday was in early autumn, right around the shooting dates. I'd planned to tell him the week before, to frame the $18, soon as a gift toward the down payment on the lake cabin he'd been talking about for years, the one with the dock and the little stone fireplace, and to invite him to watch the filming, maybe even be an extra in a crowd scene. I'd imagined his face, the way his eyes would go wide, the way he'd finally see that my world, my creativity, my inheritance could be a portal to something he'd never considered, that his wife could be the source of a story, not just the background. But that fantasy cracked the morning he laid the dinner invitation on my discharge papers. It didn't crack cleanly. It shattered in slow motion, and the pieces kept falling for hours afterward, every time I replayed his voice in my head. "You're strong. You always bounce back," as if my body were a machine that could be reset with a kind word and a little pressure, as if my recovery were a matter of willpower rather than biology. By Wednesday, I still hadn't told him about the film shoot. I also hadn't canceled it. The dinner was Friday, the shoot was Friday, the collision was absolute, and I found myself standing at a crossroads I hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. I called Simone from the bathroom, sitting on the closed toilet lid with the water running so David wouldn't hear my voice. The fan was on too, a double layer of white noise. I told her there was a personal conflict, a scheduling overlap, but that I wanted to honor the contract. I was careful not to give her the full story. It felt too raw, too humiliating to say out loud to a stranger. My husband forgot I had surgery. He invited his boss to dinner and told me to cook. Simone didn't ask for details. She just said, "We'll be there Friday at 4 p.m. sharp. Full trucks, full crew, security if you want it. This house is a dream, Mia. Thank you for trusting us with it." I hung up and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Pale, stitches hidden under the loose shirt, dark circles under my eyes. But my expression was something new, a stillness I didn't entirely recognize. The stillness, maybe, of a woman who has just placed a bet on herself and is waiting to see how the dice will land. On Thursday, I packed a small bag. Pain meds, loose clothes that wouldn't press against my incision, my laptop, a charger, the framed photo of my grandmother that usually sat on my studio desk, the one where she's laughing, her head thrown back, a paintbrush tucked behind her ear. I told David I was going to stay with my sister Lena for a night, because the noise of the dinner prep would be too much, and he'd need the house to himself to set up. He barely looked up from his laptop. Good idea. Be back by Friday morning to start cooking. I'll need you here by 10 at the latest. I didn't correct him. I just said, "Okay, David," in the same quiet voice I'd been using for years. A voice that he heard as agreement because he had trained himself not to listen for the spaces between my words. Friday morning, I didn't go home. I drove instead to Lena's apartment 40 minutes away, wincing with every gear shift, my incision pulling in sharp little reminders that my body was still stitching itself back together. Lena opened the door in her paint-splattered overalls. She's a muralist, all color and chaos, the opposite of me in almost every way, and took one look at my face and pulled me inside without a single question. She settled me on her couch with a heating pad and a cup of tea, and then she sat across from me and said, "Okay, tell me everything." I did, the dinner, the film shoot, the quiet plan I hadn't even let myself name out loud. I told her about the invitation on my discharge papers, about David's voice when he said, "You always bounce back," about the way I had nodded instead of screaming because screaming felt like a language I'd never been taught. Lena listened without interrupting, her face moving through anger, sadness, and then something else. A slow, spreading grin. When I finished, she set her tea down, leaned forward, and high-fived me. A real one, palm to palm, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "It's about damn time," she said. "Grandma would be so proud of you right now." At 3:45 p.m., I got a text from David. "Where are you? The grocery delivery is missing the shallots, and the wine glasses are still in the dishwasher. Call me." I didn't reply. I set my phone face down on Lena's coffee table and took a slow, careful breath. At 4:07 p.m., the film trucks arrived at our house. I know what happened next because David told me later in fragments, in angry phone calls, in stunned silences, in the halting conversations we had in the weeks that followed, and because Lena, who drove past the house out of sheer sisterly curiosity, described the scene to me that night with the glee of a sports commentator calling a championship play. 3 production vans, a grip truck, and a van marked "Lighting and Electrical" pulled into the quiet tree-lined street. The neighbors came out onto their porches. A woman with a clipboard and a headset, Simone's first assistant director, a brisk, efficient woman named Jo, walked up to the front door and knocked with 3 firm raps. David answered, sleeves rolled up, a dish towel over his shoulder, already stressed because the caterer he'd assumed I'd ordered hadn't shown up and the wine wasn't chilled, and Calloway was famously particular about the temperature of his Chardonnay. He expected me. He got Jo. "Hello. We're here to set up for the shoot. Everything's on schedule. Can you show us the circuit breaker? We'll need to tap into the main line." David stared at her. "The what? There's no shoot. I'm hosting a dinner party tonight. You must have the wrong address." Jo didn't flinch. She checked her tablet, calm as a surgeon. "This is the registered location for the Weller film. We have a signed contract with the homeowner, Mia Carter. She's listed as the sole property owner and signatory." She looked up, her expression polite but immovable. "You're David, I assume?" She mentioned there might be a scheduling overlap, but the contract is binding. "We'll need full access by 5 p.m. David started to argue, his voice rising. He said things like, "This is my house, and you can't just walk in here and I'll call the police." Jo listened patiently, then said, "Sir, we have a legally binding contract. The police will tell you the same thing. This is a civil matter, and the contract supersedes a verbal objection. We're happy to wait while you call your wife, but the crew needs to begin setup." Behind her, the crew was already moving. They didn't wait for permission because they didn't need it. They had a contract, and contracts don't care about dinner parties. A props master carried a stack of vintage 1960s magazines toward the living room window, setting them down on the coffee table with the care of a museum curator. A set decorator began draping sheer curtains over the existing ones, transforming the room into something softer, more period-accurate. A grip wheeled a C-stand through the front door, politely maneuvering past David as if he were a piece of furniture that happened to be in the way. Cables snaked across the hallway floor. Lights were hoisted onto stands. The conversation pit, my grandmother's conversation pit, was suddenly bathed in warm tungsten light while a young woman in a pillbox hat rehearsed lines with a stand-in, her voice carrying through the open windows. It was a calm, professional invasion, and David stood in the middle of it like a man who had just discovered that the ground beneath his feet wasn't ground at all but a trapdoor. By 5:30 p.m., when Mr. Calloway's black sedan pulled up to the curb, the house was no longer a dinner venue. It was a closed set. A security guard, hired by the production company, a large man with a friendly but immovable demeanor, stood at the bottom of the driveway with a sign on a metal stand. "Filming in progress, off-force personnel only." The front door was open, and through it the living room glowed like a jewel box. all soft light and careful composition, and the quiet hum of a creative machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. Calloway stepped out of the car, a silver-haired man in his early 60s with an expectant smile and a bottle of wine in his hand. He took in the scene, the trucks, the cables, the security guard, the sign, and the smile vanished. Behind him, more cars were pulling up. Colleagues in cocktail attire, wives and husbands, junior associates who'd been told this dinner was a command performance. They stepped out onto the sidewalk clutching bottles and wrapped hostess gifts, their expressions shifting in near-perfect unison from anticipation to confusion, to something David later described as the slow horror of watching your career implode on a landscaped lawn. David rushed down the driveway, his face flushed. "Mr. Calloway, sir, there's been a miscommunication. My wife, she didn't tell me. There's a film crew, but I can get them to leave. Just give me a few minutes." Joe appeared at his elbow like a calm ghost. "I'm sorry, sir," she said to Calloway, not to David. "This property is under a binding location agreement for a permitted shoot. We can't allow entry to anyone not on the crew list. It's a liability and insurance issue." Calloway looked at David for a long moment. Then he looked at the house, at the actress in the pillbox hat who had paused her rehearsal and was watching the commotion with undisguised interest, at the security guard who had not moved an inch. "I see," he said. Two words that carry a universe of meaning when spoken by the man who decides your future. He handed his wine bottle to his wife, who had been standing silently beside him, and got back into his car. The car pulled away. The colleagues milled about awkwardly for a few more minutes. Someone tried to ask David a question, but he was already on his phone, dialing my number, and getting my voicemail every time, and then they too dispersed, their cocktail attire looking suddenly out of place on the quiet suburban street. By 6 p.m., the only vehicles left were the production trucks. David sat on the front steps, his head in his hands, the dish towel still over his shoulder like a flag of surrender. Inside the house, Simone Weller was capturing the afternoon light as it fell through the windows exactly the way my grandmother had intended. And she was doing it in a house that, for the first time in 7 years, felt entirely like mine. I turned my phone back on at 7 p.m. I had 23 missed calls from David, 11 from his mother Patricia, and one text from an unknown number that turned out to be Simone. "Your house is magic. The light in the conversation pit is unreal." "Thank you," I called David back. His voice when he answered was raw, stripped of the smooth corporate polish he usually carried like a second skin. He sounded like a man who had been yelling for hours and had run out of volume. "You did this. You planned this." "I signed that contract 5 months ago," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "I was going to surprise you for your birthday. The $18,000 was going to be your gift. For the lake cabin. I was going to tell you on Monday." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing, could almost hear the thoughts rearranging themselves in his head like furniture being moved. "But Friday was the dinner. You knew." "I knew," I said. "And you knew I'd just had surgery. You knew the doctor's orders. You knew I wasn't supposed to stand for more than 10 minutes, wasn't supposed to lift anything over 5 pounds, and you still told me to cook for 20 people like my body was an inconvenience to your timeline." "I didn't cancel the shoot, David. I just didn't cancel my life for yours. Not this time." He hung up. The line went dead, and I sat there on Lena's couch, my phone warm in my hand, and let myself feel whatever it was that was rising in my chest. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter. Relief, maybe. Or the beginning of grief. Or both. Patricia's calls came next, a cascade of them. I didn't answer, but she left a voicemail that I saved, because some things need to be preserved as evidence of a before and after. Her voice was tight with fury, the kind of fury that only a woman who has spent a lifetime controlling everyone around her can summon when that control finally slips. "You have humiliated my son in front of his entire office. Do you understand what you've done? He needed this promotion. This was not the time for one of your artistic little projects. A wife supports her husband. That is the job. I've never seen such selfishness. Call me back immediately." I listened to it twice, once with Lena beside me, her hand on my knee. Then I texted Patricia a photo of my discharge papers, the highlighted restrictions, the bold black letters spelling out exactly what my body was and wasn't allowed to do, and a single line. "This is what support looks like when a husband puts a dinner party above his wife's stitches." She didn't reply. She would later, but not that night. The film shoot continued through Sunday. I stayed at Lena's, icing my incision, doing the gentle stretching the physical therapist had shown me, taking my pain medication on schedule, and sleeping more deeply than I had in years. Lena made me soup and drew little cartoons on my bandages and told me stories about the murals she was working on. I received occasional updates from Simone. The scene in the conversation pit turned out beautifully. The actors said it was the most authentic 1960s space they've ever shot in. Your grandmother would be proud. I cried a little at that, not from sadness but from a release I hadn't known I was holding, something that had been locked in my chest since the day my grandmother died, and I had packed up her paintbrushes and tried to become the kind of woman who didn't make a fuss. On Saturday, David showed up at Lena's door. He looked terrible. Unshaven, dark circles, the collar of his shirt wrinkled in a way that told me he'd slept in it. Lena let him in, but she stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, a silent guardian, while he spoke to me in the living room. He had spent the previous night in a hotel, he said. The production company had been polite but completely immovable. He had tried to call the agency, had tried to call Simone, had even called a lawyer, who had told him, in careful legal language, that the contract was ironclad and he had no standing to break it because his name wasn't on the deed and he wasn't a party to the agreement. Calloway pulled my name from the VP shortlist this morning, David said, and his voice cracked on the word shortlist. Kenneth got it, the promotion I've been working toward for 8 years. Gone. I didn't feel triumph. I want to be very honest about that. I felt a strange, sad ache for him, because I had loved this man for 15 years, and watching him break was not something I enjoyed. But I also didn't feel guilt. There's a difference between causing someone pain and refusing to absorb it for them, and I was just beginning to learn where that line was. I need to understand something, I said, and my voice came out quieter than I intended but clear. When you put that invitation on my discharge papers, did it even occur to you that I might be in pain, that I might be scared, that the doctor meant it when she said I couldn't stand for more than 10 minutes? David looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. I thought, you always handle things, you always bounce back. I didn't think it would actually be that serious. Because you never asked, I said. You never asked what the surgery entailed. You never read the paperwork. You never once, in 15 years, asked me what I needed before you told me what you needed. You assumed my body would perform for you the way it always has, and when it didn't, you blamed me for the interruption. He didn't have an answer for that. He sat there on Lena's couch, a man who had built his entire identity on being the smartest person in the room, and he had no answer. After a long silence, he said, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know either, I said. But I know I can't be the one who fixes it for you. Not this time. He left. Lena brought me more soup. I ate it slowly, one spoonful at a time, and let the warmth settle in my stomach. I moved back into the house 4 days after the shoot ended. The film crew had left it pristine. Simone had a reputation for respecting her locations, and it showed. The floors were polished, the windows were clean, and someone had left a small bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen counter with a handwritten note. From the crew. Thank you for sharing your grandmother's magic. The house smelled faintly of old-fashioned hairspray and something else, something I couldn't name at first and then realized was possibility. David was there. But something had shifted between us into a careful, uncertain politeness. He made coffee in the mornings and didn't ask me to make his. He asked, once, if I needed anything from the grocery store. Small things, but they felt seismic because they had never happened before. I didn't move out permanently. Not yet. I wanted to see if the man I married was still somewhere inside the man who'd spent a decade treating me as a resource. And I had one more thing I needed to do before I decided what came next. Patricia's 70th birthday fell on the following Saturday, a week and a half after the film shoot. David's family had planned a small gathering at a restaurant, but at the last minute Patricia demanded really, that it be held at the family home, our house, my house. I think she wanted to reclaim territory, to reassert the old order where she was the matriarch and I was the help. David told me about the request with a nervousness I'd never seen in him before, his eyes flicking to my face to gauge my reaction. I said yes on 2 conditions. The first, I would host on my terms, and the food would be catered. I would not be cooking. The second, there would be a toast, and I would be the one giving it. The evening arrived. Patricia swept in wearing a silk blouse and a necklace of heavy amber beads, looking like a queen returning from exile. David's brother was there, his aunt, 2 family friends, and, by David's own panicked invitation, an attempt to mend fences, Mr. Calloway. He had accepted, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of something less charitable. The table was set simply, catered food, arranged on platters, the wine chilled to the proper temperature. The house was spotless, the conversation pit, stripped of its film-set dressing, glowed softly in the evening light, and I caught Patricia looking at it with an expression I couldn't quite read. We ate. The conversation was stilted, the air thick with things unsaid. Patricia complimented the caterer's salmon with a pointedness that was clearly meant to underline that I hadn't cooked it myself. I smiled and thanked her, and let the barb pass through me without catching. Before dessert, I stood and tapped my glass with a spoon. The room quieted. "I'd like to make a toast," I said. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't trust me, and she was right not to. I didn't speak immediately. Instead, I took out my phone and placed it on the table, face up, in the center of the white linen. Then I pressed play. David's voice filled the room, recorded 5 days earlier when I'd tucked my phone into the pocket of my robe during our argument in the bedroom. I had done it without a plan, just a quiet instinct that someday I might need to remember exactly what was said. "Mia, you don't understand. I've been working toward this for 8 years, and you can't stand in a kitchen for one evening." My own voice, quiet and strained. "I just had surgery," the doctor said, his voice cutting through like a blade. "The doctor says a lot of things. You're strong. You always bounce back." My mother hosted a dinner party 3 days after her gallbladder surgery. She managed. The recording ended. The silence that followed was the heaviest silence I have ever felt. It pressed down on the room like a weight. I looked at Mr. Calloway first. "I'm sorry you were caught in the middle of this. I signed a binding contract 5 months ago to rent this house. My house, the one my grandmother left me, for a film shoot. I was going to gift the money to my husband for his birthday to help him buy the lake cabin he's always wanted. I didn't cancel the shoot because 3 days after I had organs removed from my body, my husband told me my recovery mattered less than a dinner party. I want you to know that I do not blame you for my husband's choices, but I need you to know the truth of what happened, because the story you've been told probably doesn't include the part where I was still bleeding into a surgical pad." Then I looked at Patricia, whose face had gone the color of old paper, the amber beads around her neck trembling slightly with her breath. "You raised a son who believed a wife's body was a flexible resource. You modeled that belief. You told me after my miscarriage that women in your day didn't lie around. That was the moment I understood that in this family, my pain would always be a character flaw. I'm done performing for that belief. I'm done being the supporting actress in a story where I'm not even allowed to read the script." I picked up a folder I had prepared and handed it to Patricia. Inside was a printout of the signed location contract, the $18,000 deposit confirmation, and a copy of my grandmother's will with the highlighted line naming me sole owner of the property. "This house," I said, my voice steady and clear, "has been mine since before you ever stepped foot in it. I let it become ours because I loved your son, but love isn't supposed to require erasure. It isn't supposed to require that I vanish so completely that even my stitches become invisible." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply sat back down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Patricia stood up slowly, the folder clutched to her chest. Her mouth opened and closed twice, like a fish gasping for water. Then she turned and walked out of the house without a word, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor my grandmother had chosen. Her husband followed, then the aunt, then the family friends, a quiet exodus of people who had spent 20 years treating my home as a hotel and my labor as a given. Mr. Calloway was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at me, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, once, slowly, a small dip of his chin that could have meant anything or nothing, and stepped out into the night. David stayed seated, his face a ruin. His hands were flat on the table, and he was staring at the spot where the phone had been, as if the recording were still playing, as if the words were still hanging in the air. In the quiet afterward, I said, "I'm not leaving you tonight. But I'm also not staying in a marriage where I have to fight this hard to be seen. You have a choice to make, and I'm going to give you the space to make it. That was 4 months ago. David has been in therapy, his own, not couples, because I told him he needed to fix the man who had said those words before we could fix the marriage. He goes twice a week. He has started cooking, really cooking, clumsily, with too much salt and the occasional small kitchen fire. Last week he made me soup from scratch, a butternut squash bisque that took him 3 hours and 2 phone calls to his sister for instructions. While I finished a book cover illustration at my desk, when he set the bowl down, he didn't walk away. He stood there for a moment and said, "I'm sorry I never asked. I'm asking now. How are you feeling?" Really, I looked up at him, at this man I had loved for 15 years, who had broken something between us so completely that I wasn't sure it could ever be put back together, and I said, "I'm healing, slowly. Thank you for asking. I'm not healed overnight. Neither is he." Trust isn't rebuilt in a single conversation or a single bowl of soup. It's rebuilt in 1,000 small choices, 1,000 moments where the old pattern tries to reassert itself and is gently, firmly refused. We are still learning what that looks like. Some days I'm hopeful, some days I'm not. But I'm no longer invisible in my own home, and that, right now, is enough. The $18,000 location fee sits in a high-yield savings account in my name alone. I'm using a portion of it to fund a small scholarship for young female illustrators, in my grandmother's name. The rest is earmarked for the lake cabin, but I'll buy it when I'm ready, on a deed that will bear only my signature. Not as an act of vengeance. As an act of reclamation, I chose myself. Not to punish him, but to finally stop punishing myself. And the woman who sat in that bathroom mirror the night before the shoot, pale, terrified, stitched together, and utterly uncertain, she finally started to breathe. If you've ever had to hide your own dreams inside a marriage that made you feel small, if you've ever been told your body was an inconvenience to someone else's ambition, I see you. I pinned a question in the comments. What was the moment you realized you'd been disappearing in your own life, and what did you do to take yourself back? Go to that pinned comment and tell me your story. I read every single one, and if this story made you think of a woman who had to choose herself after everyone rewrote her truth, stay close to She Chose Herself. Every voice here helps another woman feel less alone.